flutters and fibrillations, and we basically decided that the atrial flutters usually degenerates quickly into atrial fibrillation. Now, that's usually extremely rapid. Flutters are rapid, fibrillations are rapid but not sequential, if that makes sense. They're, well, and I like what the book refers to it. At some point they call it a circus rhythm, because it's all over the place. There's no pattern to what it's doing. It's out of control. And VFib, ventricular fibrillation, is always a whole lot worse than AFib. People can live nearly an entire lifetime with AFib and never really know the difference. Why is that? As usual, my talkative class here, I just can't get you to slow down with all your answers. AFib, most of the blood coming from the atria to the ventricles, 80% of it's already diffused in there. So it's not like they're not getting blood. And then they just have to pump the other 20%. In VFib, we're pumping that volume out, and it doesn't diffuse. It has to be pumped out. So if we're in a circus rhythm, or if we're in real fast flutter, or if we're losing sequence on all of it now in fibrillation, we're not going to get much done. It's creating a lot of chaos. And that's what they tell you, is that people with ventricular fibrillation can live for only a few minutes compared to years with AFib. Fibrillation is caused by continuous recycling of electrical waves, and this recycling is referred to as circus rhythms. Sudden death from cardiac arrhythmia usually progresses from ventricular tachycardia through ventricular fibrillation, culminating in asystole, and that's the heart stopping completely. Sudden death from cardiac arrhythmia is commonly a result of acute myocardial ischemia, most often due to atherosclerosis or coronary arteries, of the coronary arteries. Of course, fibrillation, if somebody's there with strong electrical shock, we've all seen the TV shows where they clear, roll them together, just hammer the far out of them, and then crank it up and do it again. That's defib, and it does actually help in a lot of cases, saved a lot of lives, because it lines up those electrical signals again. So they use a defibrillator for that. Let's look at the node blocks. There's a first, second, and third degree node block. A first degree node block occurs when the rate of impulse conduction through the AV node exceeds 0.2. So we said in our electrical excitation the other day that after the SA node sends a signal out through the atria, 0.2 of a second later it'll send the signal to the AV node, which tells the ventricles to contract. If it exceeds 0.2 seconds before that signal gets through there, if it's delayed just beyond 0.2 seconds, then we have a first degree AV node block. We're a little slow at getting the job done. A second degree, we've got quite a bit of damage here, in that only 1 out of every 2 or 3 or 4 is even passing through the AV node. So we've got some pretty serious damage. This is not setting up for a final positive thing, positive picture. The third degree are also known as a complete AV node block. That's when there's no signal at all passing through it, and that will lead to congestive heart failure really fast, because we'll have 70 beats a minute coming into the ventricles and nothing going out. Or in some cases, the best we said would be from the bundle of His that would do 30 beats out, and that's not going to cut it. The lymphatic system's the next thing listed, which we know is our second circulatory system. The standard lymph organs are your tonsils, thymus, and spleen. We know that there's not a major pump here except for the skeletal muscle pump, which is also moving ventricular blood as well. So that finishes up chapter 13. Almost got it done last week, but not quite. And takes us over to chapter 14, which is another long chapter, but chapter 14 starts applying physiology to all anatomy. We just talked about the arteries and the veins, and I mentioned some as we went through there. Give me a single descriptive term for arteries. Arteries are considered what kind of vessels? I use this term, I know we've had a little vacation here. Some have, I just got enough vacation to kind of get things caught up around home, but I missed out on the rest part. I could use today for rest, I think. You had a long trip, didn't you, Sharday?
Yes, I did.
You made it okay, I see.
Yeah.
Did you get down there, what time did you get down there?
A little after midnight.
And you left and come back up here, when?
Last night.
Oh my gosh.
I got back about 10:15 last night.
Oh, plenty of time to rest. Just the travel time would kill me on that.
Yeah.
It's as hard as doing physical labor somewhere for me.
Especially when you have people that don't know how to drive.
So we considered arteries resistance vessels. Arteries are resistance vessels. These are some things we've got to sink in. This kind of stuff's got to stick to us to survive these chapters. Veins are capacitance vessels. Veins are capacitance vessels. On page 445, they do a lot of scenarios as we go through this chapter. So, cardiac output. They start with some definitions. Cardiac output's a volume of blood pumped per minute by each ventricle. The average resting cardiac rate in an adult is 70 beats a minute. The average stroke volume is 70 to 80 milliliters per beat. So total blood volume only averages about 5.5 liters. So the regulation of cardiac rate says in a complete absence of neural influences, the heart will continue to beat as long as myocardial cells are alive. In other words, as long as it has oxygen and energy, they'll beat. Sympathetic and parasympathetic nerve fibers to the heart are continuously active to a greater or lesser degree. So under regulation of cardiac rate, we know we have the SA note sitting there beating at 70 beats a minute. As long as it has oxygen energy, it's going to continue. We can speed it up by sympathetic fibers, and we can slow it down by parasympathetic fibers. The cardiac rate is looked at by the medulla on a constant basis. So the medulla is always involved in it as well. On 446, there's a couple of terms here we need to, so there's one term on 446, and then we're going to look for the second term on 448. The first term is chronotrophic, and I have a test question about chronotrophic and inotropic. Mechanisms that affect cardiac rate is chronotrophic. So if we increase cardiac rate, that is a positive chronotrophic effect. Increased rate is a positive chronotrophic effect. To decrease rate is a negative chronotrophic effect. Now we take that and we look over to page 448 and we see the term inotropic effect. This is contractility strength. So a positive inotropic effect is increasing the strength of the contraction. So positive is always an increase. Chronotropic is rate. Inotropic is strength. A negative inotropic would be decreased strength, which I hope we'd never run across that. If anything, we want to increase strength. So I do have test questions about this. You won't probably read the paragraph below on the inotropic because it talks about how the sympathol-adrenal system should encourage a positive inotropic effect. And if possible, if parasympathetic can play a role, it would actually decrease it, and that would be a negative inotropic effect. So now that we have those two out of the way, we know the medulla is the cardiac control center, which we just mentioned. Now let's look at regulation of stroke volume. There's three things that regulate stroke volume. End-diastolic volume. End-diastolic volume is the amount of blood in the ventricles at the end of relaxation. Now, according to a guy that's on the next page, Frank Starling law, if I put Frank Starling in a nutshell here, this is what he said. The amount of blood that's in the ventricles The amount of blood that enters the ventricles will be the amount of blood pumped out of the ventricles, and there'll always be some left behind. In other words, if there's 90 milliliters of blood in the ventricle and we pump 70 to 80 milliliters of blood out of the ventricle, there's always 10 to 20% of blood left in the ventricle, and that's normal, according to Frank Starling. So, in diastolic volume, if the heart is not strong enough, let's say hypertension in the vessels is so high the heart can only pump 50 or 60% of blood out of that ventricle, leaving 40% behind, 30 to 40% behind. Then it fills back up with another 60%. Well, it's probably filling up with 70 or 80%. See it getting bigger now? We're only pumping 50 or 60, it's filling with 70, 80, we're pumping 50 or 60, and we're leaving more and more and more behind. The only way the heart can do this is quit or get bigger. And neither one of them's an encouraging thing for longevity anyway. So end diastolic volume. Number 2, total peripheral resistance, which will have a direct effect on end diastolic volume. What vessels are resistance vessels?
Arteries.
Arteries. We've got one person that's going to get that right. I'm going to drill y'all on this. The contractility or the strength of the heart. If the heart's not strong enough to overcome what's happening, it's just going to quit. It'll just kill over, and then you won't have to worry about it anymore. So, hopefully stress doesn't do you in, Curly. You're in another world this morning, Curly. You've been off in la la land. That straight hair is not working for you today.
I'm sick.
Oh, if I only had an excuse for my inabilities. The total peripheral, this is down at the bottom, talks about afterload. The total peripheral resistance presents an impedance to the ejection of blood from the ventricle, or an afterload imposed on the ventricle after contraction has begun. This can be medically significant. A person with a high total peripheral resistance has a high arterial blood pressure and thus a high afterload imposed on the ventricular muscle. That makes sense, doesn't it? If we're trying to get blood from point A, the ventricle, to point B, to the vessel, and the vessel has such high pressure that we cannot build enough pressure in point A to overcome point B, the blood's going to stay where it's at, isn't it? If we're going to diffuse, we got to go from higher pressure to lower pressure. We're not overcoming that aspect. So in summary, stroke volume is inversely proportional to the total peripheral resistance. The greater the resistance, the lower the stroke volume. It doesn't get any more clear in this chapter than that. I know y'all been on vacation, but I need some pet pills or something in here. Y'all are barely breathing, the best I can tell. The inability of the heart to compensate can lead to congestive heart failure. Normally, contraction strength is sufficient to eject 70 to 80 milliliters of blood out of the total end diastolic volume of 110 to 130. So the normal ejection fraction, there's a test question over this. Normal ejection fraction is 60%. 60% of the blood in the ventricle must be ejected each time. The blood left behind is the normal amount of blood left behind. That 60% will refill back into that ventricle, and the next ejection we've got to do 60% again. Now, does people live with less than that? Absolutely. What amazes me is people live with 25% ejection fraction. How long can they live like that? Amazingly longer than you think. Heart contractility strength, inotropic strength. We've got all kinds of drugs that can encourage that. Digitalis is one of them. But it talked about leaving the calcium out there to encourage the strength of the muscle contraction. And digitalis plays that role. I was amazed when my 92, almost 93-year-old grandmother was in the hospital and not doing well. I knew they had done a cardiac deal on her to see kind of where her heart was, because in her chart with everybody else's chart was congestive heart failure, that generic term they all like to use. I just asked them, what is her stroke volume? What is her ejection fraction? That's the questions I ask them. She was about 28% ejection fraction. How they, we see them walking around every day at 25%. So that's not what we're worried about. I mean, she was getting digital. It's amazing. But the heart can't withstand that for lengthy periods of time. So, ultimately, it'll be the demise if something else don't do it first. Which organ's gonna go out first, not getting the oxygen in the blood? It's a guessing game at that point. Which one's most damaged? Which one's weakest? The weakest link it'll fold first and drag everything else down the tubes with it. And that's just the way these systems work. I learned a lot from my grandmother's stay in the hospital, and the nurses hated me because I was always asking questions. And most of them honestly couldn't answer the questions. And I'd say, well, let me look at that chart. Well, you can't look at that chart. And I said, darn, I have every right to look at that chart. And I do. They don't want you to think that, but you do have every right to look at that chart. And so I just waited till the physician assistant come in, and she and I sat down and we answered questions. And there's a lot written in that chart you don't ever want to see. But venous return. We know venous return has a lot to do with muscle contraction. Now, they use the term here, compliance. And what they're saying is that veins are thinner, less muscular, and they have more compliance. In other words, they get bigger the more you put in them, like a water balloon. So what is the driving force? Well, there's not much pressure. We do have valves, and we have muscle contraction. So whether it's muscle contraction from moving, breathing, or both, that's number one means of venous return. I can't say it enough. So they're listed as capacitance vessels. They have a lot of compliance. And they tell you there as well that arteries are resistance vessels. So they're telling you as well as me telling you. Veins contain 70% of total blood volume at any given time. I said most of your blood's there, so 70%. Your average venous pressure, 2. Average arterial pressure, 90 to 100. Significant difference. Venous pressure is highest in the venules at 10, the lowest at the vena cava, 0. It doesn't get any lower than that one. I don't think they calculate negative figures here. So when you average it out over the distance, we get an average of 2. What aids this? They list sympathetic nerve activity. Well, that would be smooth muscle contraction in the vein walls and thus reduce compliance. Okay, if you want to increase blood flow through the body, this is what's got to happen. And there'll be scenario questions. This is one of those general rules. If you understand this general rule, you can apply it to answer questions. To increase blood flow through the body, you have to dilate the arteries and constrict the veins. We've got the pressure in the arteries, we just need to reduce resistance. So you dilate the arteries, and if we don't do anything to the veins, they just pull up, right? You dump more blood in there, they just get bigger. So if you constrict the veins, you'll build pressure and force the blood to go forward. Dilate arteries, constrict veins. Veins aren't real muscular, but during sympathetic tone can sure constrict them. And then they list skeletal muscle pump as number 2. Number 3, pressure difference between thoracic and abdominal cavity, and the bottom line on that is breathing. Of course, if you're not breathing, you don't have to worry about circulation. And they talk more about the muscle contraction pump in the next paragraph. So I think they do a good job throughout this whole chapter. That's what drags this chapter out, is they repeat themselves a lot. So they're trying to drill some points home. It's not a hard chapter. Once you gather the concepts, you can apply it to any situation and figure it out. Blood volume on 450. 2/3 of total blood volume is usually found with their water volume found within the cells. Extracellular fluids normally disturbed so that are distributed so that about 80% contained in the tissue as tissue interstitial, blood plasma accounting for remaining 20%. So your blood volume is not your high volume of fluid, it's out in your cells. That's where it's at. And if blood volume gets low and we need fluid, where do we go get it? From your cells. So we can blood's the life of the body. So if it's lacking, we'll steal fluid from the cells just to get what we need where it needs to go. So your cells dehydrate, so you may lose a cell or two. Are you still alive? Your organs are still working. That's what's important. Now, on 451, we're going to sum up this whole page with one word. What would be the word you would use to explain exchange of fluid between capillaries and tissue? It is a very simple term. That's right, it's two words. I said the simple, you just had to say diffusion, but very good. That's all we wanted. You took the hint well, to be a sleepyhead on Monday morning.
A little bit.
Yeah, I think we all are. You may have to throw some cold water on Curly in a minute, because she's bobbed off 2 or 3 times there. On 452, I have to pick on somebody, keep myself awake, Curly. On 452, clinical application. Here's a case of tropical disease filariasis, where mosquitoes transmit a nematode worm, which is an endoparasite. We've studied this, haven't we, Amber? Mm-hmm. In the humans, the larvae of these worms invade lymphatic vessels and block lymphatic drainage. So they call it elephantiasis. You can see a picture at the top of 453. We didn't have a picture of this brutal in the zoology book. But this is a gruesome and extremely brutal picture. And this is multiple infections. And the filarial worm gets in the lymph system, and literally the numbers of filarial worms is so large it blocks flow of lymph. And so the lymph fluid stays in extremities and building these large pockets of fluid. Now you can't just stick a needle in them and drain them. Scar tissue builds up to hold fluid. And so you got massive scar tissue. Is there a whole lot we can do for this guy right now? No. Plastic surgery is very limited at fixing this guy. We still have the infection. Now, up to about just a few years ago, there was no treatment for this at all. And now there is a combination treatment that is about 90% effective, I believe they tell you. Now, it's a new drug regimen has been found to be 99% effective against the parasite. To eradicate the disease is now underway. What do you think is a key component to this regimen working? Early detection. If it gets to that point, forget it. Now, we've got so much damage that it's not going to hurt. Anywhere the lymph goes, this can happen. Notice his upper right arm, upper left arm, lower extremity, and yes, his scrotum. So, can it happen to females like this? Let me ask this. Does the lymph system go through the breast or go by the breast? Absolutely. So, yeah, it can happen to females the same way. So, one that has been awful in other countries for years, we seldom ever see it in the United States, thank goodness, but it's there. And so this brings about the next topic, the causes of edema. And for those of you that's never had me in zoology, I will add this. That is the female mosquito that's doing that to you. Amber knew that, but she wasn't going to say anything.
No.
It's only the female that sucks blood. The male absolutely does nothing. Does that sound familiar? The male does nothing? Okay, just want to make sure we've got that clarified. I made it sound brutal, but the male mosquito eats nectar. And he probably wants the female to bring it to him. Would you agree with that, Charlotte?
Yeah.
Now, the female mosquito doesn't have to have the blood for herself. She actually drinks nectar as well. She needs the blood for the high protein content for her eggs. There's the evil side of that. Causes of edema. Number 1, high arterial blood pressure. If you have hypertension, your hands and feet will tend to stay more swollen than normal, okay? Because it'll try to force blood out of the vessels out into your cells. Number 2, venous obstruction. And go back to number 1. This is where doctors figured out that diuretics work well for hypertension. Because if it forces it out for swelling out here, and we're already hydrated out here, let's just get it all out of the body. So that works well. They found some sorry side effects of that with diuretics. What's your major side effect of using diuretics? Loss of what? You mumbling, Amber? Are you so weak today that you can't even speak? Lack of potassium. You will lose too much potassium with a diuretic. And so with every little bitty diuretic pill, water pill we call them, you'll take a massive potassium pill that will choke most horses. And then they'll encourage you to drink V8 and tomato juice, and the number one thing is eat a banana, high in potassium. Potassium is one of those electrolytes, too much of it will kill you, but we have a way to get rid of excess, but not enough of it to kill you just the same. So eat a couple bananas and hope the system gets rid of the extra. It's all
dried apricots work better than bananas.
Apricots have a lot, and there's several fruits out there that has a lot of potassium in them. Bananas just seems to be easier access for most people than trying to track down dried apricots. Cantaloupe actually has potassium in it as well, but you know, depends on like too. Some people just the texture of banana is just I'll eat bananas. I'll eat dried apricots. Doesn't matter. I'll drink V8 juice.
My mom eats them. It grosses me out.
Yep. Okay, number 2, venous obstruction. Obviously, if your veins were obstructed, we would end up with excessive fluid in the system because we're not returning it to the heart, and we're going to have some serious edema. They list things like phlebitis, nothing worse than fleas biting you. Mechanical compression of veins helps. They make some sleeves that you can pull up on your legs that puts pressure on the veins so they don't balloon as much, and so you're building pressure on the outside against muscles, and it keeps blood flowing a lot better. So and this produces congestion, increase in capillary pressure when the veins are becoming more large, I guess is a good way to put it. So we try to decrease that with compression. Number 3, leakage of plasma proteins and interstitial fluid. This is never a good thing when plasma proteins start leaking anywhere. But they list inflammation of allergy reactions, which would be an anaphylactic shock. Number 4, myxedema. This deals with hypothyroidism. Number 5, decreased plasma protein concentration as a result of liver disease, or even worse, kidney failure. Number 6, obstruction of lymphatic drainage. We just covered that with elephantiasis. So none of those are good situations. Those are all causes of edema. Regulation of blood volume by the kidneys. Now, we're going to see quite a bit of kidney stuff in this chapter, because you can't really talk about the heart without the kidney. Therefore, when we get to the kidney chapter, we'll talk about some heart stuff, because you can't talk about the kidney without the heart. And they're all linked somehow. So the blood volume by the kidneys. The kidney sees more blood than any other organ throughout a day's time. The total blood volume is only about 5.5 liters, yet the kidneys will see 180 liters a day. It comes out to about 45 or 50 gallons of blood a day that the kidneys will see. So it's seeing your 5.5 liters over and over and over, but it needs to. It needs to be more precise this time than that time, and it needs to change up what it needs to take out this time compared to the last time. It's what's important. That's what it comes down to. So out of all that it sees throughout a day, 180 liters a day, only about 1.5 liters of urine is excreted. 1.5 liters of urine is excreted. How many milliliters in that bottle of mineral water you've got there?
591.
591 milliliters. So we're not quite a liter. So we'd do a bottle and a half of that. That'd be pretty fair, wouldn't it? How many milliliters in that monster Gatorade you're sucking down over there? How many milliliters does it say on there? She just drinks, she don't read.
946.
946 milliliters.
What's that?
That's a lot. And that one was how much?
591.
So that's almost twice it. Really, that full is gonna be real close. So, there you go. That kinda gives you an idea. So if you know you're peeing the right amount, just carry around a Gator, a G2 Gatorade bottle, and if it fills up, then you're good. Not gonna do that, Curly? 98 to 99% amount of filtered is reabsorbed back into the vascular system. The kidney is extremely precise in what it does, there's no doubt about it. Regulation of antidiuretic hormone. This is a hormone that works in your kidney, it works in the collecting duct of the kidney that allows water to come back into the system if you're dehydrated or lack of pressure, lack of volume, put it that way. Also has a name called vasopressin. ADH will work with the angiotensin-aldosterone system. They work hand in hand. This one, diuretic makes you pee more, antidiuretic reduces urine output. It conserves. So it's gonna work in times of dehydration and thirst. That's when it's gonna work. It is made by the hypothalamus. Where is it stored? Posterior pituitary. That's right. Remember, posterior pituitary stores too, but doesn't make any of its own. So on 454, they tell you that if a person who is dehydrated or consumes excessive amounts of salt, thus drinks more and urinates less. Now, why does increasing intake of salt make you drink more and urinate less? What's our general rule here? We've
Higher
forgotten
salt.
everything I've taught y'all the first 9 weeks of this semester. Everywhere salt goes, water follows. So if you eat a lot of salt, makes you thirsty. If you have that much salt in your system, and we can get rid of limited amounts over time, it's gonna hold your water. So if you wanna gain weight, eat a lot of salt and drink a lot of water. If you wanna reduce weight, back off the salt. That'll help a lot. But we like our salt, don't we? One bag of potato chips will last you a month in salt content. That's ridiculous, the amount of salt that we eat. It's like we're almost preserving ourselves. 'Cause that's what we used to do to pork in smokehouses with those salt on them, and they wouldn't ruin because nothing would attack the salt. So that's what we're thinking, we eat enough salt, nothing will attack us. It's not working. We're attacking ourselves. So this raises blood volume, in the process dilutes plasma to lower its previously elevated osmolality. The rise in blood volume that results from the mechanisms is extremely important in stabilizing condition of dehydrated person with low blood volume and pressure. So drinking excessive amounts of water without excessive amounts of salt does not result in prolonged increase in blood volume and pressure. In that scenario, drinking large volumes of water without large volume of salt, you set up a diuretic. Water in itself is a diuretic. General rule, the more you drink, the more you pee. Take the salt out of that equation and you're gonna pee more. Add salt to the equation, urinate less. So, dilution of the blood decreases plasma osmolality and thus inhibits the release of ADH. With less ADH, there is less reabsorption of filtrate in the kidneys, a larger volume of urine is excreted, and water is therefore a diuretic. Drinking lots of fresh water flushes the system. It's nothing but good. Now, can you drink too much water? I've actually heard of people killing themselves by drinking too much water. I can't even fathom that because I don't drink enough, and I know that, but to drink that much, the headline would be, Joe urinated himself to death. You can be overhydrated. Overhydration will
Wouldn't
put
be
us.
urinating yourself because that'd be getting rid of the water, right?
Well, it would be, but, in theory, if water itself's a diuretic and you drink too much, then it would be crashing a couple different systems to try to fix the problem. And kidney system would be one of those. All right, so, well, let's take this for instance, before we move on. We have to excrete, or we typically on the norm excretes about 125 milliliters let's back up. The kidney filters 125 milliliters of filtrate per minute. 125 milliliters of filtrate. Now, how much per minute of that turns into urine on the average? Take a guess? Somebody take a guess so we can move on. This is not get kicked out of class if you're wrong day. What do you think, Sade? Guess, but anywhere between 0 and 125. Give me a guess. It turns into urine per minute.
75.
75 milliliters per minute. Anybody want to take another guess? We've got to have 5? 1. Okay, we've got 3 good guesses. Well, the average is 1 to 2 milliliters per minute turns into urine. In Sade's case, she would never get to leave the bathroom, she'd be peeing so much, and would probably urinate herself to death. But I'm glad you did that so we could use you as an example.
Glad I could help.
Thank you very much. All right, so when blood volume rises, the stimulation of stretch receptors in the atria has an additional effect. It kicks in what's called natriuretic peptide, atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP, which causes the kidney to excrete more fluid. It is your natural diuretic. It is your natural diuretic. Brings us to 455, the aldosterone. Renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. Now, we've covered aldosterone in earlier hormone chapter. This is what aldosterone does. Aldosterone reabsorbs sodium and excretes potassium. You've got to know that. And then when we apply the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system, this is, did anybody pick that one to do that?
Yes.
You get this one?
Yes.
All right, you're gonna keep us from an essay question because you're gonna do a wonderful job. No pressure, Sade. If I don't like it, we're getting an essay question. The kidney sees more blood. We've established that than any other organ. Okay? So as blood passes through the kidney, the juxtaglomerular apparatus, you already know you've been shafted, don't you? Sees this and determines if we need to conserve or not. So if we have low blood volume and low blood pressure, the juxtaglomerular apparatus will produce renin, R-E-N-I-N. Renin will then go out into the blood system where it converts a plasma protein called angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1, now an active plasma protein, circulates the bloodstream until it enters the lungs. When it enters the lungs, it'll convert to angiotensin 2. Now what converts it? Well, the scientist that came up with this was a brainiac. The enzyme that converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2 is called ACE. ACE stands for a converting enzyme. Isn't that brilliant? Man, if we had too many of those, we just couldn't even study this stuff. It'd be so deep. So we have angiotensin 2. It does one thing immediately. It causes massive vasoconstriction to increase pressure. And the second thing it'll do is it'll go to the adrenal cortex where it causes release of aldosterone. And aldosterone will start telling the kidney to reabsorb sodium and excrete potassium, which in itself will increase volume over time and fix the problem. Because everywhere sodium goes, water falls. See, that's all you'd have to answer on the essay question, so if it comes down to the essay question, that's not a problem. Right, Curly? okay. I like the positive attitude of Kurt. All right, there's your renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Takes us over to 456, your atrial natriuretic peptide, which we've already talked about, so I'm not gonna talk about it again. And vascular resistance of blood flow, I guess that's where we need to start up, and that'll be Friday. No, we'll meet, we'll have class Wednesday, my bad. But we'll start up there on Wednesday and try to knock this out this week for a test next week on this. All right.